Welcome, everybody, to a special opportunity to talk to some wonderful individuals. My name is Chris Maxwell. I'm Coordinator of Member Engagement for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. I am absolutely thrilled to have these two people with me here today to talk about some really important issues that I think we can really dive into to get a better understanding of some ways to talk to individuals who might be calling us on the crisis lines. What that might look like for crisis counselors on the Lifeline, and how to be the most effective and beneficial for those people who reach out to us. But real quickly, I want to introduce our two guests. Today we have Janet Schnell and Amelia Lehto. Janet, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, Chris, and hi, Amelia. I am Janet Schnell, and I am the Loss Division Chair Representative for American Association of Suicidology. I am also a loss survivor, meaning that my brother died by suicide over 20 years ago. I am also, my full-time job is intake at a hospital, seeing people who come in first time experiencing thoughts of suicide and needing help with depression.
Thank you, Janet. Amelia.
I'm Amelia Lehto. I'm the Resource and Crisis Helpline Coordinator in Suicide Prevention here at Common Ground in Oakland County, Michigan. We are a 24/7 crisis center. We've been in services for the past 40 years, and we provide a variety of services. My main work is providing supervision on our Resource and Crisis Helpline and overseeing our suicide prevention initiatives and our suicide loss support group. 20 years ago, I lost my best friend to suicide, and I found my passion for all things suicide prevention 10 years ago and have been here ever since. I am also on the board of directors for the American Association of Suicidology as the Crisis Center's Division Director. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Amelia. Thank you both for joining with me. I feel incredibly honored to have both of you here to help us talk about this. So we have a few questions ready to go, but feel free to talk about however you think that this might be the most helpful while we kind of go through this. And keep in mind that these are people, this video in particular is for people who answer calls from really anybody, people who are experiencing thoughts of suicide, who are in mid-attempt, and certainly for people who are either concerned for their loved ones or who have lost their loved ones. And that kind of brings me to my first question. And feel free to answer this in either order, whichever one of you wants to go first, please do. But my first question is, what's the most important thing for a crisis counselor to know or do when speaking with a suicide loss survivor on the crisis line?
Janet, would you like to start us off?
On the crisis line things, I think it would be helpful for you to start out. Sorry.
It's okay. All right. So on the crisis line, we have a number of contacts at a variety of stages of suicide loss in particular. We have people who have recently lost their loved one within the past 24 hours, and they don't know where to turn except for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Common Ground is one of the network providers locally here, and we also outreach to our local community through our local line. And the first thing we want to do is be supportive and be empathetic, as training provides. At Common Ground, we provide a 90-hour training based on empathy skills and collaborative problem solving. So that is where we start. With great compassion, great empathy, and great understanding for where this person is at in this particular moment. And we also have survivors of suicide loss that are 20 years or more out, and it may be the first time that they've ever spoken about this suicide loss. Something may have recently happened. A rock star may have recently died by suicide, and it's triggered something within them, and they need to reach out to someone, and the Lifeline is there for them. And it's an incredibly humbling experience to talk with someone when they are newly processing a loss at whatever stage. And we can be a great ear to those people and a great support to discover what's meaningful for them, what is sticking with them about that loss in particular, and what the next steps might be. Is a referral appropriate? Do we need to offer a follow-up call if they find themselves suicidal or in distress and needing that extra support within 24 hours? There's a variety of ways to connect with these contacts and support them where they're at in that time.
And so, sorry, my experience as a loss survivor is we need to be able to talk, have a place to talk, for someone to listen to what we have to say, but also allow for us to be quiet and to have that time of not having the words that we need to have. What I've noticed just from my experience is that we also have to have a variety of resources, because we're seeing more in the younger generation, they're wanting to text more than they're wanting to talk. So for me, it's more important that we have someone to listen in a variety of ways, to be empathetic, but also to have those resources where it's verbal or text messaging, just giving us a chance to talk. That's where so much of it just it opens up for us to have that availability to grieve.
Yeah, one of the things that we talk about a lot when training new people for the crisis lines is that silence can be a really powerful tool for everyone who's involved. It gives everybody a time to process what was just said. It gives people time to think about what they want to talk about next.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly, for the crisis counselor, it doesn't involve us talking so much. It requires us to listen to what the person on the other end has to say.
Yeah.
And I would also say, just to let us know we're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
As loss survivors, we feel like we're the only one, the world's moving around us, and we're the only ones experiencing this. Mm-hmm. So to have someone listen and be empathetic, not saying that, oh, I understand, when you really don't, but for us to know that we're not alone. Mm-hmm. And that's where the resources can come in handy.
Yeah.
I think that's a really great point. I guess, reflecting back, the one thing I always do when I'm connecting with a loss survivor is to ask the person that they lost name. Who is that person to them? What was their relationship like? And give them the opportunity to speak about this person who is an important part of their life still, even after their death. Maybe even more so, to help them to grieve that loss and to give them that space to process their thoughts. And the quiet space that we can provide people, that safe space, is really powerful. And it can provide a lot of insight into their own healing and give us the opportunity to listen with our full attention, whether it be through the phone, chat, or text program.
And I'm thinking, even also as you're talking, Amelia, that the other thing we need to have is our feelings are our feelings, no matter right or wrong. Mm-hmm. That we don't need to hear from another person saying, well, you may want to think about, at this point in the grieving process, it's so new, our feelings are our feelings. Mm-hmm. and they need to be validated.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, just like when talking to someone, at the risk of suicide, it's incredibly invalidating to say, oh, well, you'll be fine. You just need to work through it. You'll be fine. Mm-hmm. That's not helpful.
For me, the most irritating thing that I've heard over and over again is don't feel guilty. And it's like, don't tell me not to feel guilty, because I already do. So it's not validating the way I feel, trying to tell me how I should feel. Or people told me that I should be angry with my brother. No, don't tell me what to do. I was still not angry with my brother. I was angry more at the circumstances that was left behind.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Amelia.
Yeah, I mean, there's such a wide range of emotions, and to validate those feelings and to be mindful when they correct you, because our callers, our contacts do correct us if we are off the mark. We ingrain, it sounds like you feel, because into our volunteer trainings. And it's a really powerful statement, because it it identifies their emotion and it validates why we reflected that emotion. And they can agree with that and identify with that and give a name to how they're feeling, or they cannot and say, no, I don't feel like this. I feel sad because I've lost my brother. I don't feel angry because I lost my brother. And you know, there's all the hard emotions of that guilt, that anger, that betrayal, this bewilderment of this sudden tragic loss in their life. And yet for some, there may be relief in the suicide because of the circumstances surrounding that. And those are really complicated feelings to get into and can be uncomfortable to get into for not only the contact, but for the crisis worker to address those feelings that don't feel quite right, because it's uncomfortable to say, I feel relief because someone's died. But there may have been a lot of heartache, a lot of pain, a lot of build up to that suicide death. And some people, some loss survivors feel a sense of relief because at least they know that that end of that chaos that may have been surrounding that person is come to somewhat of an end, and yet they are left to grieve that loss and what that meant for them. So to address those uncomfortable feelings and to process that can be a great opportunity to understanding the suicide and the suicide grief that follows.
So it sounds like one of the biggest things that we can do is just to be there, to listen, validate, and to open a space of non-judgment for whatever the person wants to talk about, whether it's pain or specific emotions.
Yeah.
And we kind of talked a little bit about, you guys kind of talked a little bit about specific emotions, even complicated emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Are there things that someone who is processing a loss of a loved one to suicide, are there questions or things that are really uncertain that can be helpful to ask a crisis counselor? Are there certain things that a crisis counselor can provide to those questions that would be particularly helpful in that moment?
I would say that they just need to ask what their feelings are. You know, what feelings are you experiencing right now? And you may need to describe more what the feelings could be, but not to say this is what stage you're in, or even to say this is what you should feel, but just ask them, how are they feeling? What's going on?
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest questions we have is why? Why did this happen?
Mm-hmm.
And for them to be able to explore it, I always say in my family of 5 siblings, my brother was the second youngest, that we all came to the reason why differently, and we all have different reasons why, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why is not something that we will ever know, but it's something that we have to be comfortable with why we think that the death occurred.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. It's a very individual process for every single person involved.
And I think that's, again, you know, the validation is so powerful, especially in this stage, because there's such an uncertainty. And for many loss survivors, their life choices feel like they've been taken away because of the death of their person. You know, they didn't have a choice in the matter, and they would have done anything to intervene and to give that person a reason for living and to keep them with us. And offering choices to a contact is powerful. You know, you have the choice to, you know, talk about this. You have the choice to grieve in whatever way you feel most comfortable, that's safest for you. You know, we want to avoid drugs and alcohol and, you know, dangerous activities, and yet You know, there's still a physical release in, you know, punching a pillow or throwing a book or screaming at the top of your lungs, and giving them the variety of things that they can do with excess uh, this excess energy within them, or to let them know it's okay to cry, and that you can be there with them if they need a space to cry. And that can be a release for them, and that is a choice they have. How they grieve their loss is within their decision making at this time. You know, they didn't have a choice in their person's death, but they have a choice in the way that they are grieving that loss, and letting them know that they have, you know, there's not one way to grieve for any one person. You know, there's stages of grief which can be really helpful and help us kind of frame, you know, what to expect. And yet everyone, it looks different on, even within a family unit, you know, everyone can grieve very, very differently, and offering that space to each other and validating that, yeah, it's hard to watch somebody else be in pain, or to ignore it and put it on the shelf for another time, or never to recognize it again. That's their choice. You have the choice to address it in whatever way you feel safest and most comfortable. And this is a starting point to talking about that loss.
I think, sorry, I think the other part that we need to be very well aware too is that tragedy has hit us. We weren't expecting it. So now we're even more aware, and we become very fearful that other people are going to die by suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Or because as loss survivors, we know that we have a higher incidence of having thoughts of suicide ourselves. So we have to watch our other family members and our friends. And because of the suicide death, I know my mother went through a period of time where she had thoughts of suicide. And so we had to then worry about her, get her to the best mental health hospital so that she can help with her grieving process. It just seems like it's heightened awareness. And sometimes we maybe call them the crisis line just to say, okay, I noticed this. I need to talk through this. Should I be worried about this person? What do I need to do next?
Yeah, yeah, and it's a very interesting circumstance that a lot of people find themselves in, that they do have that heightened awareness, higher risk for their own thoughts. So, you know, I mean, one of the things that we ask our the counselors in our crisis centers to do for every call is to ask whether or not the person who's calling is thinking about suicide. Is that, I mean, does it seem to make sense to also ask that for people who are calling in who have recently experienced a loss?
Yeah, I think we should always be assessing for risk when it's appropriate. And if they say no and we believe them, we can continue on with that conversation. And if they say no and you don't quite believe them from what they're saying or how they're saying it, come back around to the question and use those prompt questions that the Lifeline has provided. You know, are you suicidal? Have you attempted suicide in the past? Have you had suicidal thoughts in the past 2 months? And have you ever attempted suicide? You know, keeping those questions in mind can be helpful in those conversations. And many centers do provide the Living Works Assist model, which can be really, really helpful. And it works really well in this situation as well, to, you know, connect and ask about suicide and discover their story, and, you know, finding the turning points, and, you know, working through the safety plans if it turns into that. But there's some really great tools that the Lifeline has provided that can be helpful in these circumstances, and to connect with these loss survivors. And some crisis centers, such as mine, do provide suicide loss support groups, or know of the support groups in their area, and connecting to those groups can be really powerful. And I guess it would be appropriate. I run a suicide loss support group, and as Janet shared, suicide loss survivors may be at a heightened risk of suicide. And I had a support group member recently die by suicide after having lost their child. And they had been with us, our group, a very short period of time, and we do risk assessment, and I was caught off guard when I received the call that this person had died by suicide, and still am processing that because it just happened, and knowing that I was as well trained as I could be, and yet we still may lose people that we come into contact with. And for us to process that loss and to do our self-care as we do, and to connect with our colleagues and especially your supervisor is key and important. And one of the hardest things on the crisis line is that we don't always know the end of what will happen after a call. We don't always get, the full circle of this person has been late to services and whatnot. And to be aware that it's okay to feel the feelings and to debrief and debrief and debrief as much as possible, and to know that you are as well trained as you can be, and that we can process and learn even further from the hardships that we do face in this work, because it is extremely unique and very difficult to explain it to others outside of this work. So when you're on the lines after a call or after an exchange or after a support group, debrief with your colleagues and your fellow volunteers.
Can I take a step back a second, though? When we were talking about the suicide loss, or asking about if you're having thoughts of suicide, I would also recommend listening to more of the words. As an intake therapist, I've heard more often, I don't have thoughts of suicide, but if I went to sleep and didn't wake up, that would be perfectly fine. So it's even knowing the other words that may be used, that maybe people aren't using the exact words of suicide, but also using other terminology.
Yeah.
So then we'll explore more in that area. Yes, and again, going back to the support groups, for me, I needed to be with someone else who understood my grief. My mother and sister were the forgivers of everyone, and I was very angry. So I felt so outside of myself, like there was no support, and I needed to have I need to have resources of a support group, so I could find someone in that group, and I did, who also understood the being very angry. So I knew then I wasn't alone, or I wasn't weird, or I wasn't wrong. So just having resources of not only face-to-face support groups, but also online support groups. More resources we have, the better it is. I don't feel like lost survivors can have enough resources, because everybody's different and unique, and some things work for one and other things work for other people.
Yeah, you guys are giving us so many good things, and yeah, I mean, to try to address a couple of them, it really is. I mean, it's incredibly important to have an understanding of self-care and self-support for people who are answering the phones, just as much as it is for people who are experiencing a loss, because it's very difficult work on both sides of it. And so we all can make our best attempts to take care of each other. And in terms of resources, yes, I mean, there are just so many resources that it's difficult for somebody who's like Janet said earlier, who's just been hit with this, to try to sift through all of the things that are out there. Support groups are a huge one. You guys have both mentioned those. What other supports, what other resources, books, websites, anything else that have been especially helpful for you all?
Well,
I know.
Yeah.
Sorry, in our support group, so I'm also a facilitator for our local support group, and one of the biggest books that continually is as checked out is Iris Bolton's My Son, My Son. And she just wrote another book that also addresses talking about suicide. And she lost her son to suicide. There's also another book by Michelle and Gus that helped me. Do They Have Bad Days in Heaven? Because directly talks to the sibling loss. So I feel that it's important to have a variety of different books within our support group for the loss survivors to be able to check out. And it could be anywhere from a video. We do the AFSPs uh, conference, the online, the November thing. Sorry, I can't think of the
The
word.
Survivor Day.
That's it. So we have the video casts from all those for years that people
Mhm.
can go back and watch. And then we have other audio books, and then we also have pamphlets, something like a little shorter read. And then we have more of the extensive reads like Iris's book and Michelle's book.
Same.
That's it. That was easy.
All right. Yeah. So, okay. I would concur with Janet that Iris Bolton's My Son is one of the top reviewed books that I've come across working with lost survivors. And her new book is, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it's quite exciting. And we can provide a link to that, which it also, there's a DVD, a companion included in her newest book. So she's getting up on technology. And there is a number of resources on the American Association of Suicidology's website. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention is a wealth of resources, and they have connections throughout the US with different chapters that have been started throughout the states, and state representatives that can connect with suicide loss survivors on a one-on-one basis. There's a number of local loss outreach programs throughout the US, which stands for Local Outreach for Suicide Survivors. That was started by Dr. Frank Campbell, who is one of AAS's former presidents. And it is a wonderful initiative that goes out onto the scene of a suicide to provide that direct support and care following the immediate aftermath of a suicide. And there has research shown that if we can get those resources early on to loss survivors, they're more likely to follow up with those ongoing supports, whether it be through local therapists that are comfortable with suicide loss and suicidality, or to those local support groups. The online support groups are wonderful. There's a number of them available. Alliance of Hope comes to mind, and they are a wonderful service. Franklin Cook provides personal grief coaching and suicide loss specific resources and supports. And there's a ton of groups on Facebook. Facebook is pretty prominent in our society, and people can find support through fellow loss survivors 24/7 if those other websites or other contacts are unavailable. And we also participate in the AFSP's International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day, which is the third Saturday in November. We provide a conference for local loss survivors who have come from all over the state to recognize this day and honor their loss. And it's often people who have never attended a support group before, which is a great benefit and service to the community, that they can come for 6 to 8 hours is generally how they've run, and they can connect with other loss survivors. And we've certainly done a great job of connecting people that have contacted us through our Lifeline and through our resource hotline to that conference as well. And there's
Can I take it?
Yeah.
Can I take a step back on books that I just thought of also?
Yeah,
That
okay.
with the support groups, I feel like we also need to have information about suicide itself. I like Thomas Joyner's Why People Die by Suicide. That we need to not only have things about the support aspect, but I was very curious about why the suicide occurred. Why did my brother die by suicide? What did I miss? So we need to have other resources, not only for the support aspect, but also education and with suicide.
Yeah.
That having more than just those types of resources. I'm also part of that lost team, Amelia, that you were talking about.
Yeah.
2 different teams. One is that I'm more active with is in the rural community, and we have seen a lot of promising hope by providing resources of people coming to the scene of a suspected suicide death. It not only helps law enforcement, but it helps the people who are investigating, but it also helps the first responders because they're not quite sure how to help the lost survivor. And being from a rural community, we have these little gadgets where uh, it goes out through the airwaves of where someone it comes out through the airwaves about, oh, there's a possible death or there is a death, and everyone, their mother, brother, neighbors, everyone shows up to the scene.
Mm-hmm.
And that lost survivor, the one who's been directly impacted, is just kind of not really supportive surrounding people, supporting them emotionally. And that's where the lost team really comes in, because we can help support them emotionally.
Yeah.
Whereas the neighbors are like, oh, can I get you a drink, or kind of not so directly involved. So
Yeah.
with the lost team, again, we see that we can get them the help that they need specifically for what they need at that time.
That's a really, really cool resource, and just the fact that you do have people who are experienced with the loss in general, but with suicide as well. And I really like how you phrased that, and that you have the people who are providing them with, like, that bring over a casserole or make sure that they have water, but there are people there who can help out in the entire situation.
Mm-hmm.
That's really neat to be able to provide that resource. So yeah, I mean, there are a ton of things out there for people who might be struggling with a very recent loss, or the loss a long time ago, or wherever they are in that process.
Mm-hmm.
I want to reiterate that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline also has resources on their website, suicidepreventionlifeline.org. But also, like, why we're talking about this, you can, as a loss survivor, and we know this as crisis counselors, use the Lifeline as a resource to process things, to just talk, to have someone to listen to.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a really valuable thing as well. But yeah, no, there's a lot of things out there. So like Janet said earlier, you're not alone while going through this. Okay, so maybe we can move on to like a really concrete, practical question for crisis counselors who are answering calls from people who may have recently or not so recently lost someone to suicide. What are some, and this is always the thing, I think, in suicide prevention, is making sure that we have cultural competency built in, and talking to someone who has recently lost someone may be similar to talking to someone who's a crisis or in a crisis, but it may be very different. And so I'm wondering if there are things, and Janet also talks a little bit about this at the very beginning of the conversation, but I'm wondering if there are additional things that are unhelpful to say. Terminology, words, situations, other things that crisis counselors probably want to steer away from. And maybe if you can provide some like helpful alternatives, that would be awesome too.
As professionals, we've been trained to use the words "died by suicide." If a lost survivor calls in and said, "My brother committed suicide," don't correct him. So there are terms that we will use, but not necessarily correct the lost survivor. Things like, being angry. Well, everyone gets angry. Don't go through the Kubler-Ross theories of grief, because it doesn't necessarily apply for lost survivors. And it's really not a therapy session. It's more about hearing for what's here and now. So it's just really listening.
Mm-hmm. It is. And I believe our crisis counselors and crisis workers are so well trained that they will avoid a lot of the pitfalls that suicide loss survivors can find themselves in, going out into the community, with the guilt and shame that's associated with them, and with the judgment of I can't believe he killed himself, or how dare they do that, or how selfish that was, or, you didn't, you don't need to feel guilty about this. I believe in general we avoid all of those types of terms and verbiage anyway, but keeping in mind, that we are entitled to have our feelings about suicide and whatever that means, and to check our own personal baggage, especially if we are suicide loss survivors ourselves. That again, this not everyone grieves the same at the same intensities, at the same paces. That this is very individualized. We can have similar themes, but the experiences can be vastly different. And our goal is to help normalize their feelings and to let them know that they're not going crazy, that they're experiencing grief, that we can understand where they're coming from and what they're saying, and appreciate the hardships that they have found themselves in. And again, we can check in for whether they're suicidal themselves and how they're comfortable talking about that suicide. As Janet said, someone can say, I want to go to sleep forever, and that can mean I'm just exhausted, or it can mean I don't want to wake up and I want to die, and I don't know how else to talk about this, because it's still really hard to talk about suicide, even if we've experienced it so intimately. We can provide education, that the statistics and the information that we have about suicide in general, this is some things that we understand about suicide, can be helpful for a lost survivor who's never experienced this and has never really reached out before, or had the opportunity to have that conversation. I apologize, our light keeps going out. And we can talk with them about safety and giving them the perspective that they are not alone, and that others have experienced similar things that they have, and that you are so grateful that they've shared this with you, that they've reached out for help, because it is still really hard to talk about this in our society. It is very isolating. As much as we know and as much as we're familiar with suicide loss, for general community members, they may never have experienced this before. And if they have, it's very hush hush, and it's very quiet, or it is not something you talk about still. And to appreciate some of that as well, and keeping that in mind, that this really is the first time that they may openly talk about it, and to be patient with them about their loss.
And even to recognize the fact that maybe the loss survivor isn't coming at it from 1 to 2 weeks or a month, that sometimes it could be 26 years before they first start talking about the loss. And so just the different experiences you have. And I know personally, the way I felt is that every time I heard of someone else who had a loss, like a recent suicide, that it almost took me back to that day one,
Mhm.
and re-experiencing those feelings. I think though what loss survivors need to know is that it does get better. As long as you continue along with that grieving process, as difficult as it is, it does get better. I can tell you 20 years later, I feel like I can be proactive and can help the recently lost survivors along with the people who have been grieving for a while, um, to better understand the grieving process, but also know that it does get better. And I still think about Kent. That doesn't go away, but it's not like I'm doing the timeline in my head anymore, where
Mhm.
it's been, and that's what I had done, is that it's been this long since I talked to him.
Yeah.
It's been a month since I talked to him. It's been a month since he died. Um, I don't do that any longer. And so I feel like at that point, and I want to take a step back, because something that we're experiencing throughout the United States is lost survivors who are wanting to jump into the next step of doing something about the suicide death too soon, before they have a chance to take care of themselves. So what we're seeing is, when we talked about, going to the Facebook pages, I have to be very careful first of all, I need to be very careful about the therapist that I recommend, because,
Mhm.
you know, it, it is not, therapists are not, we cannot automatically presume that therapists or counselors are well trained in suicide. to understand the loss process, or even understand the people who have thoughts of suicide. So I'm very specific as to who that I will even recommend because of the experience that I've had with local therapists who really would be good. But along with that, also there are other resources that I'm not going to send someone to a Facebook page that is encouraging suicide
Mm-hmm.
or inappropriate in when they talk about being proactive, where you, as a loss survivor, we need to take care of ourselves first before we can be helpful in the community, before we can do any kind of fundraising or any kind of um, conferences or meetings or being proactive in that way, because we need to take care of ourselves first. If we don't, there's a great chance that we can do more harm to our community than what we ever intended, feeling like that we're spreading the word, but there are ways to do that and ways not to do that. And so again, I want to go back and say that we need to take care of ourselves first. And so we need to have the good resources through the crisis line to say, these are the areas that we know really work well. Let's figure out what works best for you. Is it going to be a group? Is it individual therapy? Is it an online group, or is it face-to-face group? But let's take care of you first.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, and you're right. I mean, a lot of people, the first reaction is like, well, how can I make this better? How, and I hear this a lot, that I don't want someone else to experience what I'm going through, even if it happened very, very recently, and so that pain is still really fresh and may affect the way that things are done. So, yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Janet. That's really important to keep in mind. Taking care of ourselves has to be one of the top priorities. Um, well, I mean, I think I'm kind of out of questions, but do you guys have anything that you want to add? Anything that you want to make sure that we cover that we haven't yet?
Can I do a little plug?
Yes,
No.
please.
Every year, the American Association of Suicidology has a conference, and on the Saturday of the conference is called the Healing Day, where we all come together as lost survivors and meet together and have workshops and sharing groups, and it's all about the lost survivor. Our next conference will be in Washington, D.C. in next April, and so I welcome anyone who would like to have more information, who would like to contact me. Um, Coming face to face with people throughout the world who have experienced the loss for suicide is so comforting, just to know that not only in my area in Indiana, in my county, but also throughout the world, that they're experiencing things that I experience, but also they have other resources and other help.
I want to say how grateful I am to both of you for taking this time out of your day, out of your busy day, I'm sure, to help us kind of work through this and think about really important things that we need to be doing and we need to be doing better on the phones and in our everyday lives. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate you all taking time to have this really good discussion, and I appreciate the Crisis Care Line, the people who are out there who are, that when we need someone the most, that they're there to answer the phone and be empathetic and give us that chance to talk.